This is WFYI News Now. It's July 25th, and I'm Abriana Herron. On today's show, misinformation about how Vice President Kamala Harris will get on the ballot. A vigil held to honor the life of an Indianapolis activist. A new state law requiring schools limit students' access to cell phones. And we have a story on the challenges and strengths of rural hospitals in Indiana.
The people in the community that work in the hospitals, that come to the hospital, that support the hospital, they all know each other. And that makes a huge difference.
Those stories are coming up, but first, Indiana was one of the first stops for presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris. WFYI's Jill Sheridan reports the vice president spoke to a crowd of thousands of black women at the Indiana Convention Center Wednesday.
Harris's speech at the Zeta Phi Beta sorority's National Boule was planned before President Biden's announcement that he would not seek re-election. At the sold-out event, Harris told the crowd that voters will have a choice between two different visions of America.
One focused on the future, the other focused on the past. And with your support, I am fighting for our nation's future.
Much of the speech focused on accomplishments of the Biden administration, including a cap on insulin, school debt forgiveness, and Medicaid expansion. The sorority said while they don't endorse political candidates, they do support voter education and getting people to the polls. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Jill Sheridan.
And since President Joe Biden withdrew from the presidential race, and with Vice President Kamala Harris likely to replace him as the nominee, there's been a lot of misinformation about how she'll get on the ballot. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Brandon Smith reports on how major party presidential nominees get on Indiana's general election ballot.
It doesn't matter that Kamala Harris wasn't on Indiana's primary election ballot for president. Primary results only really matter to a presidential candidate for the purposes of winning delegates for their national party conventions. With Biden withdrawing from the race, Indiana's Democratic delegates are unbound and free to vote for whomever they choose, and they've all declared for Harris. Indiana law says getting major party presidential candidates on the general election ballot simply requires the state party chair to certify to the election division the names of the nominees for president and vice president as chosen by the National Party Convention delegates. The party chair this year must do so by September 10th. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Brandon Smith at the State House.
A vigil Tuesday night honored the life of Indianapolis activist Ron Frieson, known as Ron G., who was shot and killed last week. The gathering brought together hundreds of community members who were touched by G in his work to reduce violence in the city. Close friend and fellow activist Dee Ross led the candle lighting and balloon release, urging people to remember the love G tried to spread.
And that's how we got to show up for each other, you know what I mean? Show more love, spread more hugs, conversate, have more relationships, talk to each other.
G founded Ceasefire Indy and worked closely with Ross on violence reduction efforts. Ross says that work will continue.
He's left a legacy. Now it's his children and their peers who's going to take Ceasefire to the next journey.
G was found shot in his car at a gas station near 38th and Arlington Avenue on the near northeast side. IMPD have no suspects in custody and say the investigation is active and ongoing. A new state law requires schools to limit students' access to cell phones in the classroom. As Indiana Public Broadcasting's Tony Sandlaben reports, the middle and high schools in Fort Wayne will now use the Yonder pouch to hold devices during the day. This follows the district's successful pilot program to make phone-free spaces.
The Yonder system secures small electronics in a magnetic pouch during the school day. The pilot program showed a near 5% increase in GPA and a more than 35% decrease in behavioral issues at participating schools. But board member Jennifer Mathias says she's concerned that the system will not send students the right message.
If we have to have this Band-Aid to do it, maybe that's what we need, but I really want our students to learn to respect authority, because they're going to have to do that once they walk out these doors.
The plan is to have the pouches ready for use by the beginning of this coming school year. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Tony Sandlaben.
And for our final story today, When a community is facing a disaster, healthcare facilities can become a vital part of the response. As Indiana Public Broadcasting's Abigail Ruman reports, rural hospitals can face unique challenges in those moments, but also have some advantages over larger hospitals in cities.
Rural hospitals may not have the same resources available if they encounter a disaster. For example, they may have fewer people to staff the facility and fewer options to divert people if they can't provide care. Scott Cormier oversees emergency management at MedXL, a facility services provider that exclusively focuses on healthcare. He says rural hospitals have to adapt using the resources they have. One of the advantages he's seen in rural hospitals is a higher sense of community.
The people in the community that work in the hospitals, that come to the hospital, that support the hospital, they all know each other. And that makes a huge difference.
Cormier says rural hospitals can work with transportation and communications companies in their area to strengthen their emergency response plans in the future. For Indiana Public Broadcasting, I'm Abigail Ruman.
That's all for today's episode of WFYI News Now. Our podcast is produced by Drew Dodlin, with support from the news team at WFYI and public media journalists across the state. Our news director is Sarah Neal Estes. Kendall Ancheron produced our music, and I'm your host, Abriana Herron. If you like today's episode, remember to subscribe and share, and follow WFYI on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube to check in on our newsroom throughout the day. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.